On the morning the blue wren returned, Clara Vale knew that someone had opened a door her husband had spent 16 years keeping shut. The little bird waited on the kitchen table beside the bread knife. It was no larger than a walnut. One wing was smooth and blue, the other gray where the glaze had failed. A hairline crack crossed its breast. Clara had shaped it from a thumbful of clay when she was 19, during a night firing at Harcourt Pottery, and she had not seen it since the week she married Edwin. There was no note, only the bird, wrapped in a square of old newspaper and left inside the back door before dawn. Clara lifted it carefully. Even after 16 years, her fingers remembered the shallow print beneath the left wing. Her own thumb had made it. On the base, almost hidden by ash, were 2 letters scratched with a needle. C.R. Not C.V., the initials she had carried since her wedding. C.R. for Clara Rowan, the name she had once placed on every test tile she made, back when she believed a working woman's name could remain attached to the work of her hands. Behind her, the stove lid rattled. Oatmeal thickened in the iron pot. Upstairs, her husband crossed the bedroom, and the old boards complained beneath his careful tread. Edwin always walked carefully before breakfast, as if the day were a room he had entered before anyone else and did not wish to disturb. Clara closed her hand around the wren. She had fed 3 boarders before 6, packed her daughter's school dinner, blacked Edwin's best shoes, mended the loose button on his exhibition coat, and laid out the white shirt he had forgotten to collect from the laundry. None of those tasks troubled her. Work had never frightened Clara. It was the way work disappeared once she had done it that had begun lately to feel like a kind of burial. Edwin entered the kitchen with his collar open and his hair still damp. At 41 he had grown handsome in the polished manner of a store window. His moustache was trimmed each Sunday. His cuffs were never frayed, because Clara turned them before they showed wear. He was chief salesman at Harcourt Pottery now, and tonight he would stand beneath the electric lamps of the new Riverview Hotel, while buyers from Cincinnati and Pittsburgh admired the company's latest dinner service. The service was called Ohio Dawn. Clara had named the color 12 years earlier. Edwin glanced at the clock, at the oatmeal, and then at the blue wren in her hand. His face changed so slightly that another woman might have missed it. Clara saw the tightening at the corners of his mouth. He asked where she had found the bird. She told him it had been left at the door. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached for it, not roughly, but with the confidence of a man accustomed to receiving whatever his wife held. Clara closed her fingers. "It is only a spoiled trinket," he said. That was his first mistake of the day. The second came when he added that she ought not to bring it to the exhibition. Clara had not said she meant to. Their daughter Nell came down before Edwin could explain himself. Nell was 15, narrow as a reed, with Clara's gray eyes and Edwin's talent for appearing composed when she was angry. A roll of drawing paper protruded from her school satchel. Edwin noticed it at once. He reminded her that the principal had requested maps, not decorative nonsense. Nell answered that the drawing was for the Women's Pavilion at the County Industrial Fair. Miss Bell had chosen 3 pupils to submit designs. Edwin's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. The county fair was a month away, but the words Women's Pavilion had already acquired a dangerous sound in their house. The committee was led by Mrs. Adelia Holloway, a widow who had inherited 2 brickworks, refused to sell them to the Harcourt family, and recently announced that she intended to open an art pottery employing women under their own names. Edwin called the project a rich woman's amusement. He said it would close before Christmas. Nell lowered her eyes. Clara watched her fold the drawing more tightly beneath the strap of her satchel. Then Edwin turned to the matter of the evening. The exhibition was important, Mr. Harcourt would attend. Buyers would attend. The new hotel had invited newspapermen. Edwin said Clara must wear the brown silk and the jet comb. She should not discuss the years she had spent in the dipping room, or the decorating loft, or beside the kilns. If anyone asked, she kept a respectable boarding house and devoted herself to her family. He spoke gently. Edwin almost always spoke gently when asking Clara to erase herself. Mel looked from one parent to the other. Clara set the blue wren beside her plate. She asked what was disrespectable about making pottery in a town where nearly every roof was dusted white with clay. Edwin sighed. He explained that buyers preferred to imagine beauty coming from clean studios and educated designers. They did not wish to picture women with cracked nails, carrying wearboards through heat. He said there was no shame in honest labor, of course. There was simply no need to display every rung of the ladder after one had climbed it. Clara asked which of them he believed had climbed. That ended breakfast. Edwin left with his exhibition coat over one arm. At the back door he returned, kissed Clara's forehead, and advised her not to be difficult tonight. He meant it as tenderness. That was the trouble. Cruelty would have been easier to name. After he had gone, Nell touched the blue wren with one finger. She had seen the same bird before, she said. Not that exact one, but its shape. It was painted in pale blue beneath the rim of the Ohio dawn plates. Clara looked at her daughter. Edwin had never noticed the resemblance. Mr. Harcourt had never noticed either. Men who sold a thing often saw less of it than the women who washed it. Clara wrapped the wren in her handkerchief and slipped it into the pocket of her plain work dress. By 8, the Vale boarding house had emptied. 2 kilnmen had gone down the hill toward the factory. Mr. Peake, the widowed telegraph clerk, had carried away the cold biscuits she saved for his noon meal. Clara cleared the dishes, swept coal dust from the passage, and carried lemons to the yard. East Liverpool rose around her in brick, smoke, and steep streets. The Ohio River lay brown beneath the bluff. Across the water, West Virginia hills were softened by morning mist. Factory chimneys marked the sky in every direction. The Harcourt stacks stood tallest, 4 dark fingers above the roofs. At 9, the first factory bell sounded. Clara stopped with a wet sheet between her hands. The bell had governed half her life. It had called her mother to the decorating loft before Clara was born. It had called Clara into the clay rooms at 14. It had announced fires, injuries, dismissals, weddings, and once the death of a child who crawled beneath a ware cart. Even after Clara left the factory, her hands still measured the day by its voice. This morning the bell struck twice, paused, then struck once more. An irregular signal, a kiln problem. She felt it before she understood it, the old tightening beneath her ribs, the body's memory of heat moving where it should not move. By 10, a boy from Harcourt Pottery arrived at the back gate. He was coated in white dust to his eyelashes and carried a covered dish. Edwin had sent it, he said. The exhibition decorator needed a replacement sample because one of the Ohio dawn platters had cracked in the hotel. Clara removed the cloth. The platter looked perfect at first. Its rim faded from cream to the pale smoky blue that had made the service famous. 3 tiny wrens flew beneath the edge. Edwin had added gold lines around them 2 years ago, claiming the older pattern looked too humble. Clara turned the platter over. The footring was colder than the center. She tapped the edge with her fingernail. Instead of a clear high note, the plate answered with a dull complaint. She held it toward the window. Beneath the blue glaze, a net of cracks had begun to open. Crazing could be beautiful when intended. This was not. The glaze and body were pulling away from one another. Once hot food touched the service, some pieces would split. The boy said 3 cups had already broken while hotel servants washed them. Clara asked whether the kiln had been fired by Silas Bell. The boy shook his head. Mr. Harcourt had dismissed Bell on Monday. Edwin Vale had said the old man drank and could no longer be trusted. Clara's grip tightened around the platter. Silas Bell had not taken a drink in 9 years. She asked who had fired the exhibition ware. The new foreman, Amos Pike, had done it. Pike had come from Trenton with letters of recommendation, bright waistcoats, and the belief that a pyrometer could tell him everything a kiln man learned through skin, scent, sound, and flame. Clara examined the white scars on the bottom of the platter. Pike had cooled the kiln too quickly, but that was not the whole trouble. The clay body itself was wrong. Harcourt had changed something. She told the boy to carry the platter back and warn Edwin not to place hot food on any Ohio Dawn piece until the test rings had been checked. The boy looked miserable. Mr. Vale had ordered him to bring the replacement home because Mrs. Vale could paint over the crack before evening. He had said she would know how. For a few seconds, Clara heard only the linens snapping on the line. Before strangers, Edwin preferred a wife who had never touched factory clay. When a plate failed, he remembered every skill she possessed. Clara covered the platter again. She told the boy she would not paint over a crack. At noon, Silas Bell came to the boarding house. He was 63, stooped in the shoulders, and clean-shaven except for an uneven patch beneath his chin. Without the red glow of the kiln on his face, he looked older than he had 3 days before. He did not ask for coffee. He stood in Clara's kitchen with his cap between his hands and stared at the wrapped blue wren on the table. Then Clara understood who had left it. Silas said he had kept the bird because her mother told him to. Lydia Rowan had made a pair during the winter of 1879. Clara had shaped a third years later, copying the one she remembered from childhood. Silas had believed the little grey-winged bird belonged to Clara, but after his dismissal, he examined the base beneath stronger light. The initials were not C.R. What Clara had always read as a C was an L, bent by the point of the needle. L.R. Lydia Rowan. Clara sat down. Her mother had died when Clara was 6. That was the family sentence, repeated so often it had become a wall. Lydia had taken fever while visiting a cousin in Wheeling and was buried there. Clara remembered no funeral, only her Aunt Martha arriving with a black bonnet and taking her away from the room above the cooper's shop. Silas looked at the floor. Lydia had not died in Wheeling, he said. She had collapsed in Harcourt's decorating loft after months of trembling hands and stomach pain. The factory doctor called it weakness. Everyone in the dipping rooms knew it was the white lead in the glaze. She lived another year. Harcourt paid for a bed at St. Agnes Hospital in Pittsburgh, on the condition that no one in town spoke her name in connection with the sickness. Lydia spent that year working with Silas and a chemist named Nathan Holloway, Adelia Holloway's late husband, to make a safer glaze. The blue wren was one of their tests. Clara could not make the room remain still. The stove, the window, Silas's cap, and the chipped sugar bowl all seemed to move a fraction away from their proper places. She asked why no one had told her. Silas answered that men with families had been afraid. Women with children had been more afraid. Nathan Holloway died in a brickworks accident. Lydia grew too ill to return. Harcourt bought the formula, locked the test pieces away, and required those involved to sign statements calling the work his own improvement. Silas had signed. So had one other witness, Agnes Vale, Edwin's mother. Clara stared at him. Agnes had been a decorator then, not the widow in black silk who now corrected Clara's vowels and pretended never to have entered a factory except through the front office. She had worked at the table beside Lydia Rowan. Silas said Lydia died in Pittsburgh in February 1881. Agnes brought the news. She also brought money for Clara's aunt and instructions that the child be told a simpler story. Clara's hand moved toward the wren, but stopped before touching it. Silas had not come only to confess. When Harcourt dismissed him, the company ordered his work cabinet emptied. Behind a loose board, he found the wren and a small packet of fired clay strips. He had kept both. The strips carried Lydia's glaze marks. If Ohio Dawn was failing now, those tests might explain why. Clara asked where the strips were. Silas looked toward the door. Agnes Vale had them. He had taken the packet to her first, believing age might have softened her. Agnes accepted it and told him that the dead required peace, not witnesses. Then she sent the wren to Clara, perhaps from guilt, perhaps as a warning. Silas could not tell which. The second factory bell rang over the town. This time it gave the ordinary noon signal. Men would be opening dinner pails beneath the sheds. Girls in the decorating loft would shake white dust from their skirts. Edwin would be arranging untested plates beneath electric lamps and telling buyers that Ohio Dawn represented the future. Clara rose. She put on her dark bonnet, wrapped the failed platter in a towel, and slid the blue wren into her pocket. Silas asked whether she was going to the factory. Clara said no. She was going to see her mother-in-law. Agnes Vale lived in a narrow brick house on 5th Street, 3 blocks uphill from the factory smoke. The brass knocker shone even on wet days. Her curtains were Nottingham lace. She kept no boarders, took in no sewing, and spoke of poverty as if it were a contagious habit other people acquired through carelessness. When Clara arrived, Agnes's hired girl said Mrs. Vale was resting. Clara handed the girl the cracked platter and asked her to say that Ohio Dawn had come to call. Agnes received her in the parlor. She was 64, though she admitted to 59, and wore mourning colors for a husband dead almost 20 years. Her back remained straight. Her hair, iron gray and abundant, was arranged in a style that required another woman's hands. Behind her hung a portrait of Edwin at 20, painted just after he entered Harcourt's sales office. No factory dust touched him. No mother stood beside him. Agnes looked at the platter and then at Clara's pocket. She knew at once that Clara had spoken to Silas. Clara did not ask about the glaze strips. She asked where Lydia Rowan was buried. Agnes's fingers pressed into the arms of her chair. She said the past had become confused. Poor women moved often. Hospital records were unreliable. It would do no good to disturb Edwin on the most important day of his career. Clara repeated the question. Agnes looked toward the door, making certain the hired girl could not hear. Then she said, Lydia had no stone. St. Agnes Hospital buried charity patients in a common section of Allegheny Cemetery. The word charity entered Clara like a blade. Harcourt had paid for silence, not care. Her mother's work had entered thousands of homes. Her body had entered an unmarked grave. Agnes insisted there had been no choice. In 1880, a woman dismissed from Harcourt could not simply cross the street and find clean employment. Every pottery owner knew every foreman. A troublesome decorator could be refused by 6 factories before noon. Agnes had been widowed in everything but name. Edwin's father drank, disappeared for weeks, and left debts behind him. Edwin was a small boy. She signed Harcourt's statement because she needed her place. Clara understood fear. She had lived with enough of it to recognize its shape. But Agnes had not merely kept silent in 1880. She had carried the silence forward, year after year, polishing it until it resembled respectability. She had watched Clara enter the dipping room at 14. She had watched Clara marry Edwin. She had accepted Lydia's daughter at her table and corrected the way she held a spoon. "You knew," Clara said. It was the first of only 3 short sentences spoken plainly between them that afternoon. Agnes lowered her eyes. Clara unwrapped the platter. The fine cracks were easier to see now. One ran directly through a painted wren. Agnes said Edwin must not learn any of this before the exhibition. Mr. Harcourt had promised him a partnership if the Ohio Dawn contracts were large enough. Partnership meant security for Nell. It meant a proper house for Clara, fewer boarders, and an end to coal smoke in the kitchen. Agnes spoke faster as she listed the benefits, as though comfort could be stacked high enough to hide a grave. Clara asked for Lydia's test strips. Agnes denied having them. Clara placed the blue Wren on the polished table. The older woman's face lost its color. She admitted that Silas had brought a packet, but claimed she burned it. Old mixtures were dangerous. Half the marks meant nothing. Clara had a habit of turning every household difficulty into a question of principle, and principles did not keep a roof repaired. Clara lifted the Wren again. Beneath it, on Agnes's perfect table, remained a pale ring of clay dust. Her mother-in-law had not burned the strips. A woman who could preserve white gloves for 30 years did not destroy the one object that proved she had once been brave enough to help another woman. Clara left without arguing. On the steps she met now. The girl should have been at school. Her cheeks were flushed from climbing the hill, and one braid had come loose beneath her hat. Miss Bell had sent her. Mrs. Holloway wished to speak with Clara at the old stoneware shop on Market Street. She had heard that Harcourt's exhibition service was cracking. News moved quickly in a pottery town. A cup might break in a hotel scullery at 9, and by noon, 3 competing owners would know which kiln had fired it. Clara asked why Nell had been with Mrs. Holloway. Nell hesitated. For 6 Saturdays she had attended drawing lessons at the old shop. Miss Bell had paid the first month. After that, Mrs. Holloway let her help clean brushes in exchange for instruction. Edwin knew nothing. Clara should have been angry at the deception. Instead, she saw how naturally silence had passed from one generation of women to the next. Lydia had hidden a formula. Agnes had hidden a witness statement. Clara had hidden her designs. Now Nell hid the simple fact that she wanted to draw. The pattern was not made of cowardice. It was made of doors that opened only when women entered sideways. Clara took her daughter's hand. Together they walked downhill toward Market Street. The Holloway shop had once produced stone crocks and drainpipe. Its yard was crowded with broken molds. Inside, however, the old building had begun to change. North windows had been cleaned. 6 work tables stood beneath them. A small test kiln occupied the rear room, and shelves held bowls shaped like leaves, narrow vases, tiles pressed with Queen Anne's lace, and small animals made from river clay. Each piece bore a name, not a company stamp, a woman's name. Mrs. Adelia Holloway came from the kiln room, wearing a canvas apron over a plum-colored dress. She was 50, broad-shouldered, and richer than any woman Clara knew. Yet there was clay beneath one thumbnail. Beside her stood a younger woman with copper-colored hair and tinted spectacles. Miss Miriam Sloane had studied chemistry at the new Women's College in Baltimore and had spent 2 years trying to persuade pottery owners that glaze sickness was not female imagination. On the work table lay 4 Harcourt shards. Miriam explained that the clay body contained more lime than the older Ohio Dawnware. Someone had changed the body to lower the firing temperature. The glaze had not been adjusted. It fit the old body, not the new. The result would fail under heat. Clara picked up a shard. She rubbed the broken edge against her lower lip, where small changes in texture could be felt more clearly than beneath a finger. The body was softer. Harcourt was trying to save coal. Mrs. Holloway said 20 complete services were already arranged in the hotel ballroom. Supper for 60 would be served on them that evening. Clara imagined hot soup entering those bowls. She saw cracks race outward beneath painted birds. She saw servants blamed, girls dismissed, buyers injured, and Edwin standing beside the wreckage, with his smooth hands and his wife's stolen color on every table. Mrs. Holloway did not ask Clara to save Harcourt. She offered her a position. The new workshop would open officially at the county fair. Miriam would oversee glaze safety. Clara would direct shape and decoration. Her name would appear on the ware she designed. The wages were modest until orders came, but there would be a share of profits, written plainly into the partnership agreement. Clara almost laughed. She had come expecting a question about a cracked platter. Instead, a woman had placed a future on a scarred work table and spoken as if Clara had the right to consider it. Then she thought of the boarding house mortgage, Nell's shoes, Edwin's promised partnership, and Agnes's certainty that security justified every silence. Mrs. Holloway seemed to read the answer in her face. She said the offer would remain open until Monday. She also said something else. Nathan Holloway had left a locked tin box among his effects. Adelia opened it only after Silas came to her that morning. Inside were notes from the Safra Glaze experiments of 1880. Most pages were in Lydia Rowan's hand. Agnes did not possess the only evidence. Clara gripped the edge of the table. Miriam placed one copied page before her. The writing leaned forward, hurried and narrow. Clara had seen it only once before, on the back of a childhood picture book where her mother had written her name. At the bottom of the page stood a sentence. Blue holds true when the fire is kind. Clara touched the words. She did not cry. The grief was too old and too new at once. It filled her without finding a way out. Mrs. Holloway said Nathan's box contained formulas, firing observations, and one unfinished petition asking Harcourt to remove lead from the dipping rooms. There was no legal claim that could restore the dead. Too many years had passed. The company would say Lydia was an assistant. Men on the board would defend the Harcourt name. But the truth could still be named. Clara folded the copied page once and slipped it beside the Wren. Then she asked Miriam how long the test kiln would take to fire Lydia's glaze. By 4 that afternoon, Clara had changed from her work dress into the brown silk Edwin chose. She wore the jet comb because it had belonged to Aunt Martha, and because refusing it would give Edwin an argument too small for the day. In her pocket were the blue Wren and Lydia's copied note. Nell sat at the kitchen table, shading a design of river reeds and flying birds. Clara had told her she could continue the Saturday lessons. She had not yet told her about the offer from Mrs. Holloway. Some hopes were too fragile to expose before one knew whether courage would hold. Edwin arrived early, flushed from the factory and smelling of bay rum. He carried a small box from the jeweler. Inside lay a gold brooch shaped like a rose. He fastened it to Clara's collar himself. His fingers trembled. He said the evening would change their lives. Mr. Harcourt had all but promised the partnership. 2 Pittsburgh buyers were ready to order. The cracked pieces had been removed, and Amos Pike swore the rest were sound. Clara asked whether Edwin had tested them with boiling water. His hand stopped. He said there had been no time. Clara told him not to serve supper on the ware. He asked how she knew there was danger. She described the new clay body and the glaze tension. She kept her voice calm. If the factory changed the body to save coal, every piece had to be refitted and fired through a proper trial. Painting over visible cracks would not stop the strain. Edwin looked toward the parlor where the boarders might hear. He closed the kitchen door. Then he said the sentence Clara would remember long after the evening itself had faded. Do not make yourself important in this. He did not shout. He did not insult her. He simply placed his hand over the truth and expected it to stop breathing. Clara removed the gold rose and set it in its box. Edwin stared at her as if she had slapped him. She said she would attend the exhibition because Nell's school drawings were displayed in the hotel passage and because she wished to see what happened. She would not wear payment for her silence. His face hardened. For the first time, fear showed through the polish. Edwin admitted that he had recommended the cheaper body. Coal prices had risen all winter. Mr. Harcourt wanted economies, and Edwin found a Trenton supplier who promised the same whiteness at a lower temperature. The test pieces looked sound. Pike had agreed. Clara asked whether Silas Bell agreed. Edwin said Silas had become stubborn. He had refused to sign the firing sheet and threatened to speak to Harcourt's competitors. A modern factory could not be governed by an old man's superstitions. So Edwin had dismissed him. The truth settled between them. Edwin had not merely ignored a warning. He had removed the man who gave it. He had chosen the new clay because it made him appear clever. Now he needed Clara to stand beside him, dressed in silk, while the plates carried her design and his mistake. Nell's pencil had stopped moving in the next room. Clara opened the door. She told her daughter to fetch her coat. Edwin said Nell was not invited to the supper. Clara answered that neither were cracked plates, yet both would be there. It was a cruel remark. She knew it. But after 16 years of swallowing every sharp word, the first one she allowed herself tasted less like triumph than blood. They rode to the hotel in silence. The Riverview had opened only 2 months before. Electric bulbs lined the entrance, startling and white against the November dusk. Carriages crowded the street. The river below reflected factory flames in long, trembling strokes. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into a temple of American manufacture. Harcourt vases stood on draped pillars. Dinner services filled glass cases. A banner declared that Ohio clay and Ohio labor could equal the finest European ware. No worker's name appeared beneath any piece. The Ohio Dawn tables occupied the center of the room. Cream plates, blue rims, gold lines, 3 small wrens in flight. Clara saw her youth repeated 60 times beneath folded napkins. Edwin left her before she removed her cloak. He moved among buyers with easy warmth, introducing Mr. Harcourt, praising Pike's modern methods, and speaking of the service as the result of years of company research. Clara watched men lift cups toward the light. None tapped the rims. None turned them over. Mel's drawings hung in the passage, with work from other school children. Her Riverview design had been pinned at the far end, partly hidden behind a potted palm. Mel stood before it, pretending not to mind. Agnes arrived in black silk and immediately noticed the missing gold brooch. Clara told her she had left it at home. Agnes understood. She whispered that this was not the place for old grievances. If Edwin lost the partnership, the whole family would suffer. Clara asked which family Agnes meant, the family that sat in the ballroom, or the woman beneath an unmarked stone in Pittsburgh. Agnes's mouth trembled. Before she could answer, a bell called the guests to supper. Mr. Harcourt welcomed them from a small platform. He praised progress, American ingenuity, and the loyal families whose service had built the company. At the word families, Clara heard a woman behind her murmur that Harcourt girls could be replaced by Monday if they joined the decorators' wage petition. Soup arrived in Ohio Dawn bowls. Clara watched steam rise. At the first table, a buyer dipped his spoon. At the second, a woman in green silk lifted her bowl by its handles. The sound began softly. Tick. Then another. Tick. Tick. To anyone outside a pottery town, it might have sounded like spoons against china. Clara knew better. It was the sound of glaze opening under heat. Across the ballroom, 60 bowls began to whisper. One split cleanly beneath a hotel waiter's hand. Hot soup poured across the cloth and into a buyer's lap. A woman cried out, Another bowl cracked at the base, then a third. Guests pushed back their chairs. Servants rushed forward. Edwin stood motionless beside the platform. Clara reached the nearest table and told the waiter not to lift the bowls. Let them cool where they were. Moving them would make the break worse. Mr. Harcourt demanded to know who had spoken. Edwin found his voice. He laughed. It was not amusement. Clara knew the brittle edge of panic. He put one arm around her shoulders and announced that his wife had once been a common pottery girl and still imagined every chipped saucer required her command. The men nearest him smiled because they thought her husband had made a harmless joke. Edwin continued. Clara kept a boarding house now, he said. She'd been away from factory work for years. The hotel servants had shocked the ware with boiling water. There was no defect in Ohio dawn. Then he gave her shoulder a small warning squeeze. The gesture was almost invisible. Nell saw it. Agnes saw it. Silas Bell, standing in the open ballroom door in his clean Sunday coat, saw it too. Clara removed Edwin's hand. She did not make a speech. She did not expose Lydia's notes. She did not tell the buyers that the little birds beneath their spoons belonged to her. She simply picked up one unfilled bowl from a side table, turned it upside down, and tapped the foot ring with the handle of a knife. A dead sound answered. She took an older Ohio dawn plate from the display case. Edwin tried to stop her, but Mr. Harcourt raised a hand. Clara tapped that plate. It rang clear across the ballroom. Old and new, truth and imitation. No long explanation was needed. Miriam Sloane stepped through the door, carrying 2 wrapped clay shards. Mrs. Holloway followed. Mr. Harcourt's expression changed. He recognized danger when it wore a good dress and arrived with witnesses. Clara placed the 2 pieces before him. She explained that the factory's new clay body matured at a lower heat, but the glaze had not been fitted to it. The surface would continue to crack. Painting the breaks or blaming servants would not change what the kiln had already said. Mr. Harcourt turned on Pike. Pike turned on Edwin. And Edwin, with the whole town's respectability watching, looked at his wife. For one terrible second, Clara believed he might tell the truth. Instead, he said she had given him the formula years ago. If it had failed, perhaps her calculations had been unsound from the beginning. The ballroom became quiet. There it was. Not shame, not carelessness, but choice. When forced to decide between Clara and his own standing, Edwin offered her to the room as quickly as you might offer a cracked plate to the rubbish cart. Nell made a sound behind her. Clara did not turn. If she saw her daughter's face, she might break in a way no kiln could explain. She took the blue Wren from her pocket and placed it beside the 2 plates. Then she said only this: "That color was never yours." She walked out before anyone could answer. Rain had begun over the river. Clara walked 3 blocks before realizing she had left her cloak in the ballroom. Cold water darkened the shoulders of her brown silk. Carriage wheels hissed over the street. Behind the hotel windows, electric light turned every moving figure into a shadow on gold curtains. She did not know where to go. Home belonged to the boarding house mortgage, the stove, the beds she aired, and the meals she prepared. Yet Edwin's razor stood beside the wash basin. His slippers waited beneath their bed. His name was painted above the front bell because a married woman taking boarders alone invited questions. Even her refuge had been arranged around him. Clara found herself outside the old Holloway shop. Mrs. Holloway had left a lamp burning in the front window. She opened the door before Clara knocked and asked no questions. She gave Clara a coarse towel, a wool shawl, and a chair near the test kiln. Miriam arrived 20 minutes later. She carried Lydia's copied notes beneath her coat and wore an expression of contained fury. Harcourt had ordered the ballroom cleared. Pike disappeared through the kitchen. Edwin remained with Mr. Harcourt and the Pittsburgh buyers. Silas had taken Nell home. Clara nodded. That was all she needed to know. Inside the test kiln, 4 tiles rested in darkness. 2 used Lydia's old proportions. 2 carried Miriam's adjustments to remove the last of the lead. They would not be ready until morning. Clara sat before the kiln and listened to its low breath. People imagined firing as a violent act. They saw flames and heat and believed strength came from force. In truth, a kiln required patience. Too much draft chilled one wall. Too little oxygen muddied color. A hurried rise trapped weakness beneath a shining surface. The fire did not create character. It revealed whether clay, glaze, shape, and time had been made to agree. Clara wondered what the ballroom had revealed about her marriage. At 10:30, Nell entered with Silas. The girl carried Clara's cloak and the brown paper bundle containing her drawing. She had removed the gold rose from its box at home and left the empty box on Edwin's pillow. Nell did not cry. She placed the cloak around her mother's shoulders, then sat on the floor beside the kiln. Silas said Harcourt's night shift had been stopped. All wear made from the new body was being separated. Men cursed Edwin in the yard because a stopped kiln meant lost hours. Women in the decorating loft feared the company would close for a week and blamed them for the damaged orders. Clara felt the familiar pull of responsibility. Other people's wages had always been the rope used to lead working women back into silence. If she corrected the formula privately, Harcourt might reopen sooner. If she did not, innocent families would suffer. Mrs. Holloway understood the trap. Harcourt possessed experienced chemists and could return to the old body at once. The factory was not helpless. It was merely unwilling to bear the cost of its own decision. Clara was not required to donate her mind to protect a company that had hidden her mother's death. The words sounded sensible. Sense did not quiet Clara's knowledge that Mrs. Donnelly in the gilding room had 5 children, or that young Ruth Caskey paid her father's medicine from decorating wages, or that Silas's dismissal had already removed bread from one table. Nell leaned against her knee. She said her father had watched them leave, but had not followed. That small fact wounded Clara more deeply than the ballroom accusation. At midnight, they returned to the boarding house. Edwin was waiting in the kitchen. He had removed his coat and collar. Without them, he looked neither polished nor important. He looked like the young clerk Clara had once loved, standing in a room she had made warm. The boarders had heard enough gossip to remain upstairs. A thin line of light showed beneath Mr. Peake's door. Silas went to his own room. Nell stood beside Clara until Edwin asked to speak with his wife alone. Clara told Nell she could stay. Edwin flinched. He began with the factory. Mr. Harcourt had suspended Pike. The buyers postponed their orders. Edwin's partnership had vanished, though he had not yet been dismissed. Harcourt demanded the original Ohio Dawn formula and every test Clara possessed. Clara said the company already had the formula she gave Edwin 12 years ago. Edwin admitted that it was incomplete. There had been 3 final adjustments. Clara had written them on a clay tile because paper beside a wet bench was useless. Edwin copied 2 and forgot the 3rd. The original tile broke during a move. The old body tolerated the error, but the cheaper body exposed it. Clara remembered the day. Nell had been ill with croup. Edwin came to the kitchen asking for her notes because Mr. Harcourt wanted a pale blue line for a hotel contract. Clara explained the proportions while holding a steaming kettle near the child's bed. Edwin promised to copy everything carefully. The famous Ohio Dawn formula had been incomplete from its first firing. For 12 years, skill in the clayroom had compensated for Edwin's omission. Silas fired by eye and instinct. The mixers adjusted each batch. Decorators rejected pieces before they left the bench. Hundreds of unnoticed hands protected Edwin's reputation until a cheaper body and a proud foreman removed the last margin of mercy. Edwin said none of that mattered now. Harcourt needed Clara to reconstruct the adjustment by morning. In return, he would keep the factory open and refrain from pressing a claim against her for taking company designs to Holloway. Clara almost admired the neatness of the threat. Nell asked her father how a design made before her mother's marriage could belong to Harcourt. Edwin told the girl not to speak of matters she did not understand. Nell held his gaze. She understood that her father introduced Clara as a common pottery girl when he wanted laughter, then called her a company designer when he wanted ownership. She understood very well. Edwin's face reddened. He turned back to Clara and said she had humiliated him before his employer. Clara thought of the 3 short words she had spoken in the ballroom. She thought of the laughter that preceded them, of Edwin's hand on her shoulder, and of the ease with which he blamed her. She told him the blue was not the only thing that had never belonged to him. The house, she reminded him, had come from Aunt Martha. The boarders paid the mortgage. Clara's work bought Nell's books, coal in lean months, and the suit Edwin wore when Harcourt first promoted him. Edwin paid his wages into the household when he could, but during 2 panics and 1 long winter of reduced hours, it was Clara who kept them from losing the roof. She had never counted those facts against him. He had counted on that. Edwin looked toward the stairs, toward the rooms where men paid for Clara's cooking and clean sheets. Perhaps for the first time, he saw the boarding house not as the modest background to his career, but as labor arranged into walls. Still, he asked for the adjustment. Clara said no. It was not revenge. Harcourt could return to the sound body and rehire Silas. The factory could pay for proper trials. She would not help them conceal the danger or allow Edwin to claim her work again. He asked where he was supposed to sleep. Clara answered that his mother possessed an immaculate spare room. Nell inhaled sharply. Edwin stared at Clara for a long time. Then he climbed the stairs, packed 1 valise, and left. The front door closed without a slam. Clara stood in the passage until the sound of his steps disappeared downhill. Only then did she begin to shake. Nell wrapped both arms around her waist. Clara pressed her face into her daughter's hair and allowed herself 1 minute of grief. Not because Edwin had gone, because part of her still wanted him to return immediately, see everything clearly, and become the man she had mistaken him for. No kiln could perform that change in a minute. By Sunday morning, the story had split into as many versions as there were churches in East Liverpool. In one, a jealous wife ruined her husband's promotion. In another, a dismissed kiln man and a rich widow conspired to steal Harcourt's best pattern. Some said Clara had thrown a plate at Edwin. Others said every bowl exploded at once and scalded a Pittsburgh millionaire. The Gazette printed only 4 careful lines about an unfortunate service failure caused by improper handling at the Riverview Hotel. No worker was named. At First Methodist, women turned their heads when Clara entered. Mrs. Pease, whose husband supplied crates to Harcourt, moved her handbag from the pew as if Clara might contaminate it. At the rear, 3 decorators made space for Nell and Clara between them. Agnes sat in her usual place near the front. Edwin was not beside her. The sermon concerned the duty of wives to build peaceful homes. Clara almost laughed when the minister described silence as a woman's gentle strength. Beside her, Mrs. Donnelly pressed a calloused finger to her lips, though whether to hide anger or amusement, Clara could not tell. After the service, Agnes waited beneath the stone arch. She looked smaller than she had in her parlour. Edwin had spent the night in her spare room, but left before breakfast. Mr. Harcourt summoned him to the factory at dawn. Agnes had come to ask Clara, once more, to give him the missing adjustment. Clara asked whether Agnes had brought Lydia's test strips. The older woman's expression closed. They parted without agreement. On Monday, Harcourt Pottery reopened with the old clay body. Silas was not rehired. 32 women in the decorating loft were placed on half-time until the exhibition losses could be recovered. Edwin retained his title, but lost authority over production. Pike returned to Trenton. Clara accepted Mrs. Holloway's offer. She signed her maiden name beneath the partnership terms, Clara Rowan Vale. Her hand paused over the middle word. Edwin's name represented 16 years, a daughter, a house, disappointment, companionship, and memories not all of which were false. She would not pretend her marriage had never existed, but neither would she let it swallow the name her mother gave her. The Holloway women called the workshop Riverbird Pottery. There were 8 of them at first. Miriam managed glaze preparation and records. Clara directed forms, decoration, and firing tests. Silas accepted a place as kiln advisor on the condition that a younger woman learn every part of his work. Ruth Caskey came on the afternoons Harcourt did not employ her. So did an Irish handlemaker named Bridget Kane, a widowed mold press operator named Sarah Pell, and 2 sisters from the Yellowware factory. Nell swept floors after school and drew birds in the margins of discarded patterns. The first test firing failed. Lydia's pale blue crawled away from the edges and gathered in thick drops. Miriam believed the local feldspar differed from the material named in Nathan Holloway's notes. Silas thought the kiln's lower chamber drew too strongly. Clara blamed herself for expecting the dead to hand her a finished answer. The second firing produced a muddy green. The third blistered. Each morning, Clara opened the kiln with hope held so tightly it became pain. Each morning, the shelves offered bowls and tiles that were almost right. Almost was a merciless distance. She could imagine Edwin hearing of the failures and deciding they proved he had always been the practical one. At home, the boarding house continued. Clara rose at 5, cooked breakfast, worked at Riverbird until 3, returned to prepare supper, and painted trial designs after Nell slept. Tiredness settled into her bones. Edwin's absence did not reduce the labor of the house. It merely removed the person who had once mistaken it for atmosphere. The boarders responded in different ways. 2 Harcourt men left, saying their foreman disliked employees lodging under Clara's roof. Mr. Peake remained. Silas remained. A young schoolmistress took the empty rear room, followed by a seamstress whose husband had died in a barge accident. Their rent covered what was lost, but the town noticed that Clara now lodged women. Someone painted the word traitor on the back fence. Nell found it before school. She fetched a brush and whitewash. Clara joined her. They covered the word together, though its darker outline remained visible through the first coat. That afternoon, Edwin came to the yard. He carried his valise, but he did not ask to return. He had come for 2 sales catalogs and the winter overcoat stored in the attic. His eyes rested on the fresh whitewash. He said Harcourt men had not done it. Clara asked how he could know. He could not. Inside, the unfamiliar women's coats on the rack unsettled him. He spoke to Nell with stiff kindness and asked about school. Nell showed him neither anger nor affection. She answered as she might answer a customer at a counter. While Clara searched the attic, Edwin waited in the kitchen. On the table lay 6 blue test tiles, all failures. He picked up one with a blistered surface. Clara returned in time to see him turn it over. her name was scratched into the back. He set it down carefully. Then he said Mr. Harcourt intended to petition the County Fair Board to exclude Riverbird Pottery from the industrial pavilion. Harcourt claimed the workshop used proprietary designs and formulas. If the board agreed, Mrs. Holloway could lose the best chance to attract buyers. Clara asked why Edwin warned her. He answered that Mel had drawings in the women's pavilion. It was not enough. But it was the first time in 16 years he placed their daughter's work ahead of his employer's comfort. Before leaving, he glanced at the stove. Clara had baked apple cakes for the boarders. He asked, almost shyly, whether one was spare. The request angered her more than a demand might have. Home had trained him to believe food appeared even after love was injured. Clara wrapped one cake in paper. She did not do it because he deserved it. She did it because she refused to let his blindness redefine her generosity as weakness. Edwin accepted the packet with both hands. At the door, he said Agnes had not burned the glazed strips. Clara waited. He had seen the packet inside his mother's locked sewing chest when he was a boy. It bore Lydia Rowan's name. Agnes told him it contained patterns from a dead friend, and that touching it would bring misfortune. He had forgotten until the blue wren appeared. Clara asked whether that was why he recognized the bird at breakfast. Edwin nodded. As a child, he had once opened the packet. Inside were clay strips, a hospital receipt, and a folded statement with the Harcourt seal. Agnes caught him before he read it. She struck him across the face and made him swear never to mention Lydia Rowan. Clara felt the cold November air through the open door. Edwin said he truly did not know the rest. He had grown up understanding only that the Rowan name was dangerous, that factory work belonged to a past his mother despised, and that advancement required distance from people with clay on their clothes. It was an explanation. It was not an excuse. Clara told him so. He lowered his head and left with the apple cake beneath his arm. Agnes arrived after dark, carrying the sewing chest. It was walnut, bound in brass, and heavier than a box of thread had any reason to be. She refused to let Mr. Peake carry it. She placed it on Clara's kitchen table and stood beside it without removing her gloves. Nell came downstairs. Agnes asked her to leave. Clara said she would stay. The older woman seemed ready to object. Then she looked at Nell, and perhaps saw Lydia's eyes, or Clara's, or the long consequence of every adult who had decided a child was safer with a lie. She unlocked the chest. Beneath folded lace, old mourning ribbons, and Edwin's baby gown, lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth. The clay strips were narrow as fingers. Some were white, some were grey. 2 carried patches of quiet blue. On their backs, Lydia had marked mixtures with scratches, circles, crosses, and groups of lines. The code matched Nathan Holloway's notes. There was also a hospital receipt. Harcourt Pottery had paid $12 for Lydia Rowan's first month at St. Agnes. No further payment appeared. After that, the hospital listed her as a charity patient. Agnes removed the final paper. It was not merely a statement. It was an assignment of invention. According to its language, Cyrus Harcourt had conceived the safer glaze process, while Lydia Rowan, Nathan Holloway, Silas Bell, and Agnes Vale had acted under his direction. Their signatures transferred any claim to the company. Lydia's signature was a cross. Clara stared at it. Her mother could write. The copied notes proved that. Agnes confessed that Lydia never signed. By the time Harcourt produced the document, she was too ill to hold a pen. The cross had been witnessed by Agnes and Silas. Silas protested, but Harcourt threatened to dismiss every relative they had in the pottery. Agnes made the mark herself. In exchange, Harcourt gave her $75. She used the money to send Edwin to commercial school in Pittsburgh. The room became very quiet. Edwin's clean cuffs, his careful voice, his place in the sales office, and every step he called climbing had begun with money paid for Lydia's false consent. Agnes said she told herself it was compensation. Lydia would have wanted one child to escape the dipping room. Clara had already gone to Aunt Martha. Edwin's father was useless. $75 could alter a boy's life. And it had. Nell asked whether Agnes ever sent anything to Clara. Agnes closed her eyes. She had not. Years later, when Edwin announced he meant to marry Clara, Agnes tried to prevent it. She claimed Clara lacked manners and education. The truth was that Clara's presence threatened the respectable story Agnes had built around her son. When the marriage happened anyway, she watched Clara closely, always expecting the past to rise through her hands. Then Clara developed Ohio Dawn. Agnes recognized Lydia's blue immediately. She told Edwin to take the design to Harcourt. She said a husband had legal and moral authority over work produced in his house. She believed attaching the glaze to Edwin's name would bury Lydia's story forever and secure the future that the $75 began. Clara could barely breathe. Edwin had not acted alone. His shame had been taught, fed, dressed, and rewarded long before he understood its cost. Agnes sat down for the first time. She expected Clara to hate her. Part of Clara did. Hatred would have been clean. Yet the woman before her was not Cyrus Harcourt. She was a 19-year-old widow, in all but law, trapped beside poisonous glaze with a hungry child who made one frightened choice and then spent 22 years defending it. The first choice had been fear. The rest had become ambition. Clara asked why Agnes had sent the Wren. Agnes admitted that Silas's visit broke something in her. She held the bird after he left and remembered Lydia making the first one. Lydia said wrens survived winter because they knew every hidden place in a wall. Agnes carried the bird to Clara's door before dawn, intending to knock. She could not. She left it and returned home with the strips, hoping Clara would understand enough to be warned, but not enough to ask questions. It was the kind of half-courage that had governed Agnes's life. Nell touched the hospital receipt. She asked where Lydia's own letters were. Agnes looked startled. There had been one letter from the hospital. Lydia dictated it to a nursing sister because her hands shook too badly to write. Agnes received it after the burial and hid it with the packet. Years later, during a winter when Edwin was ill and there was no coal, she burned papers for kindling. She said Lydia's letter had been among them. Clara turned away. The admission hurt more than the false mark. A formula could be reconstructed. A final letter could not. Agnes began to recall its contents, but Clara stopped her. Memory filtered through 20 years of guilt was not her mother's voice. She would not accept another woman's version as a replacement. Agnes wept then, not delicately. Her face folded. Her shoulders shook beneath black silk. Nell moved as if to comfort her, but Clara placed one hand over her daughter's. A child should not be required to ease the pain of an adult's confession. When Agnes regained control, Clara gave her the sewing chest and kept the packet. Agnes asked whether she would expose the false assignment at the fair hearing. Clara said yes. The older woman warned that Harcourt might accuse her of forgery or theft. Silas's signature made him vulnerable. Edwin's career would certainly end if he supported Clara. Clara answered that Lydia's grave had been quiet long enough. Agnes left without asking forgiveness. That was the first honest gift she gave Clara. The Fair Board hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the county courthouse. Mr. Harcourt's complaint ran 6 pages. Riverbird Pottery, he claimed, had lured away employees, stolen production knowledge, copied the Ohio Dawn Wren, and damaged confidence in a leading local industry. His attorney requested that the workshop be barred from exhibiting any blue-glazed ware. Mrs. Holloway hired a lawyer from Steubenville. Miriam prepared chemical comparisons. Silas rehearsed his account and forgot half of it whenever he became angry. Clara did not sleep well. At 3 each morning, she woke hearing the ballroom bowls tick beneath hot soup. Sometimes Lydia stood beyond them, faceless, waiting for Clara to restore a voice she had never truly known. Other times, Edwin stood there, wearing Cyrus Harcourt's face. During the day, work saved her. She studied Lydia's test strips beside Miriam. The scratches revealed a progression. Lydia had reduced white lead slowly, replacing part of the flux with borax and feldspar. The final blue strip was not the end of her experiment, but a direction. Clara began from that direction instead of trying to reproduce the exact past. She changed the clay body. River mud made the early pieces coarse, so she blended local ball clay with a cleaner material from Kentucky. Miriam adjusted the borax. Silas slowed the cooling and sealed a draft crack in the kiln wall. The fourth firing gave them a blue that was clear but too bright. The fifth softened near the rim. The sixth emerged on a Monday morning after a night of sleet. Clara opened the kiln at dawn. Heat touched her face. On the middle shelf stood 12 small cups, 6 tiles, a shallow bowl, and a clay wren Nell had modeled. Nothing had crawled. Nothing had blistered. The glaze carried the color of the river just before sunrise, when brown water briefly held the blue of the sky. It was not Ohio dawn. It was deeper, quieter, and less eager to please. Clara lifted one cup with padded tongs. Silas heated water. Miriam protested that the piece had not cooled enough, but Clara needed to know. They waited until the cup could be handled, then filled it. No ticking came. Clara tapped the rim. The note was clear. Nell laughed. Silas turned away and wiped his face with his sleeve. Miriam wrote the firing result in a fresh book beneath 3 names. Lydia Rowan, Miriam Sloane, Clara Rowan Vale. Clara looked at the list. For the first time, inheritance did not feel like a debt or a grave. It felt like women standing at the same bench across time, each leaving enough room for the next pair of hands. They named the glaze River Blue. By evening, 12 women had visited the shop to see it. One touched the surface and asked whether it truly contained no white lead. Miriam explained that no pottery glaze could be treated carelessly, but their mixture removed the ingredient most closely associated with the palsy and colic suffered in dipping rooms. Ventilation and clean handling still mattered. Riverbird would provide both. Word reached Harcourt before supper. The following morning, Edwin came to the shop. He had lost weight. His coat was brushed, but one cuff had begun to fray. Clara noticed it, and hated that habit made her fingers want to turn the cloth. Mrs. Holloway offered him no chair. Edwin said Harcourt intended to call him at the hearing. The attorney wanted him to testify that Clara devised Ohio Dawn after marriage, using company materials he brought home. Under Ohio law, the ownership question could be made unpleasant, particularly because Clara once entered Harcourt's decorating room after hours. Clara remembered that night. Edwin had taken her through the side door because Mr. Harcourt wanted samples by morning. Nell was too. Clara worked until dawn, while Edwin slept in a chair near the warm kiln. He had called it helping her husband. Now the same night would become evidence against her. Edwin said he had not agreed to testify. Mrs. Holloway asked whether he had refused. He had not. Clara studied him. Regret had begun its work, but regret was still asking to be protected from consequence. He wanted her to see the man he might become, before he had done what that man required. She told him the hearing was Thursday at 10. He said he knew. Before leaving, he saw Nell's clay wren on the cooling shelf. One wing dipped lower than the other. He smiled despite himself and said it looked ready to fall. Nell answered that it was landing. The smile disappeared. Edwin touched nothing. He walked out into the sleet. The county courthouse smelled of wet wool, coal smoke, and floor polish. Factory owners filled the front benches. Decorators, dippers, kiln men, and mold makers stood along the walls. The fair board sat behind a long table beneath a portrait of President McKinley. Though the question concerned a display booth, everyone understood that more was being judged. Whether a working woman's skill could exist apart from the company that employed her husband. Mr. Harcourt spoke first. He was 68, white-haired, and practiced in the paternal language of owners. Harcourt Pottery fed hundreds of families, he said. Its reputation belonged to the town. Competitors who traded on private grievances threatened every dinner pail in the valley. He described Clara as a former decorator with no chemical education. He praised Edwin's years of faithful service. He called Riverbird's design an imitation. His attorney displayed an Ohio Dawn plate. Then Mrs. Holloway placed Lydia's blue wren beside it. The age of the little bird could not be proved by appearance alone, Harcourt argued. Any clever potter could stain a new piece with ash. Silas testified that he fired the wren in 1879. His voice shook until the attorney suggested drink had damaged his memory. Then Silas became calm. He named the kiln, the shelf, the clay pit, the week of the firing, and the exact place where a roof leak cooled the west wall. 3 retired workers in the room nodded. Miriam explained the glaze differences. She used plain language. Ohio Dawn contained a traditional lead flux. River Blue did not. The colors resembled one another because both drew from Lydia's experiments, but the new glaze was chemically and artistically distinct. The attorney asked whether Lydia had worked for Harcourt. She had. Then everything she made in the factory belonged to the company, he said. Mrs. Holloway's lawyer produced the assignment with the false cross. The room shifted. Harcourt said the document settled the matter. Lydia Rowan had willingly transferred her claim. Clara stood. She did not describe her mother's death in grand language. She gave the dates from the hospital receipt. She showed Lydia's written notes and then the cross beneath the assignment. A woman who filled 20 pages in her own hand did not sign her life's work with a mark while still conscious and willing. The attorney asked whether Clara had witnessed the signature. She had been 6. Then she could not know. He was right. Clara said so. She knew only that 2 living witnesses remained. Silas had already admitted the truth. Every face turned toward Agnes. She sat in the last row. Clara had not known she would come. Agnes wore the black silk she reserved for funerals and carried no reticule. For several seconds she did not move. Then Mr. Harcourt spoke her name. He did it softly, almost kindly. He reminded her that his family had supported hers after her husband failed. He spoke of Edwin's education. Gratitude entered the room, disguised as a chain. Agnes stood. She walked to the front without looking at Clara. The board chairman asked whether she witnessed Lydia Rowan make the cross. Agnes gripped the rail. "No," she said. One word. It seemed to release 22 years of air from the courthouse. She admitted making the mark herself. She admitted accepting money. She admitted that Lydia was already too ill to consent and that Cyrus Harcourt dictated the statement. Her voice broke only once, when she said Edwin's schooling had been purchased with the price of another woman's name. Mr. Harcourt rose in outrage. His father was dead and could not answer slander. Agnes had become confused with age. The assignment remained valid company property. Then Edwin entered. He had been standing outside the courtroom for nearly an hour. Clara knew because she had seen the shadow of his shoes beneath the frosted glass door. He could have entered beside Harcourt. He could have entered beside his mother. Instead, he waited until choice became unavoidable. The attorney called him forward. Edwin looked at the Ohio Dawn plate, the blue Wren, and Lydia's notes. Then he looked at Nell, who sat between Miriam and Silas. He testified that Clara developed the Ohio Dawn color. No one moved. He described the kitchen tasks, the clay tile, the night Clara worked in Harcourt's decorating room, and the missing adjustment he failed to copy. He admitted submitting the design under his own name. He admitted allowing Mr. Harcourt to believe he created the flying wrens. He admitted recommending the cheaper body against Silas's warning. The attorney tried to stop him. Edwin continued. He said Clara had not stolen from Harcourt. Harcourt had profited from her work for 12 years without placing her name on a single plate. Mr. Harcourt dismissed him before the sentence was finished. Edwin's face changed, not because he had not expected it, but because expectation did not soften the sound of a life closing. He took his seat alone. The fair board withdrew for 20 minutes. When its members returned, they denied Harcourt's request. Riverbird Pottery could exhibit river blue and the Wren forms under the names of their makers. The board had no authority to decide ownership of Ohio Dawn or the validity of Lydia's assignment. Those questions would require a court, but the physical and testimonial evidence was sufficient to distinguish Riverbird's work. It was a narrow victory. Outside, reporters surrounded Agnes and Edwin. Factory men shouted that Clara had cost the town orders. Decorators pressed close to see the blue Wren. Mr. Harcourt passed without looking at anyone. Clara stood on the courthouse steps beneath a colorless sky. Edwin approached. He said he was sorry. The words were quieter than rain. Clara believed him. Belief did not repair what he had done. She thanked him for telling the truth, and then walked away with Nell. Truth did not make the following weeks easy. Harcourt Pottery reduced its shifts again. Mr. Harcourt said cancelled orders left him no choice. Men who had once nodded to Clara on the street now blamed her for empty hours. Someone broke 2 windows at Riverbird. A dead rat appeared on the shop step, with blue paint across its back. Mrs. Holloway replaced the glass and hired a night watchman. She did not pretend courage was free. Every repair came from the money intended for clay, wages, or fair displays. Riverbird's first large order also failed to appear. Visitors admired the blue cups and asked whether women truly made them. They praised the shapes, turned the pieces over to read the names, and then hesitated at the price. Harcourt ware was cheaper. Imported porcelain carried greater status. Principle pleased customers until it cost 20 cents more. Clara learned that naming work did not guarantee anyone would value it. The women continued. They produced small objects that could be sold without wealthy buyers. Salt jars, children's cups, bedside pitchers, tiles for stove surrounds, and sturdy bowls with reeds pressed around their rims. Clara refused to let Riverbird become a parlor novelty. Beauty belonged beside oatmeal and wash water, as surely as it belonged beneath hotel chandeliers. At night, she revised shapes by lamplight. Her hands ached. The burns on her wrists reddened in the kiln heat. More than once, she wondered whether Edwin's promise of a better house might have been the wiser path. She could have given Harcourt the adjustment, worn the gold rose, and lived inside a lie comfortable enough that most people would call it happiness. Then she would turn over a Riverbird cup and see Bridget Kane's name, or Ruth Caskey's, or her own. The doubt never vanished. It simply ceased to command her. Nell suffered in quieter ways. 2 girls at school called her mother a thief. The principal removed Nell's fair drawing from the passage until the controversy passed. Miss Bell restored it the next morning and offered her resignation if it was taken down again. Nell pretended the matter did not hurt. She worked harder at the shop and spoke less at home. Clara recognized the danger. Silence could look like strength while it hardened around a wound. One evening she found Nell tearing her Riverview design into narrow strips. Clara gathered the pieces but did not scold her. She admitted that the choice to confront Harcourt had cost Nell something she never agreed to pay. A mother could act rightly and still leave bruises on her child's life. Clara said she was sorry for that cost. Nell began to cry. She had not wanted an apology. She had wanted permission to admit that truth frightened her. Edwin had lost his position. Agnes no longer attended church. Harcourt workers muttered when Nell passed. She feared Riverbird would fail, and the family would have sacrificed everything for a blue cup no one bought. Clara held her. She could not promise success. She promised only that Nell would never again have to become smaller to protect an adult's pride. Together they pasted the torn drawing onto a fresh sheet. The seams remained visible. Nell added gold paint along them, not to hide the breaks, but to make their path part of the river. That repaired drawing won second place at the county fair. Edwin learned of it from the Gazette. He had found work as a traveling notions salesman for a firm in Wheeling. The position paid half his Harcourt salary and required him to carry sample cases through rain to general stores that often refused to see him. He rented a small room above a harness shop and returned to East Liverpool on Sundays. At first, his visits to Nell were awkward. He brought peppermints, asked questions about school, and left before supper. Nell did not call him father in Clara's hearing. She did not ask him to stay. Edwin kept coming. He learned the names of her drawing teachers. He sat through a women's pavilion lecture on industrial design without explaining the subject to anyone. When a storekeeper in Wellsville ordered 6 Riverbird pitchers, Edwin sent the order directly to Mrs. Holloway and accepted no commission. Clara noticed these things. She did not reward them with forgiveness. Forgiveness offered too early could become another form of forgetting. Agnes changed more slowly. For a month, she remained inside her brick house. Her hired girl did the marketing. Women who once sought her opinion crossed the street. First Methodist requested that she resign from the Benevolence Committee, not because she forged Lydia's mark, but because her public confession embarrassed an important manufacturer. Then, one Tuesday morning, Agnes appeared at Riverbird wearing an old calico dress beneath her black coat. She asked for work. Mrs. Holloway stared at her. Agnes said she could paint a line finer than any decorator Harcourt currently employed. Her hand was not as steady as it had been, but she would accept beginner's wages until she proved it. Clara believed the request was another attempt at penance. She refused to turn the workshop into a chapel where guilt purchased absolution. Riverbird employed women who needed wages. Agnes replied that she needed them. Mr. Harcourt had called in a private debt left from Edwin's father. Whether the debt was legally sound hardly mattered. Fighting it would consume the value of her house. Agnes had sold the brass bed in the spare room and dismissed the hired girl. Clara saw no justice in the reversal. Poverty did not purify a person. It only narrowed her choices. Mrs. Holloway gave Agnes a trial. The older woman's first painted border was flawless. She worked in silence beside girls whose mothers she had once ignored on the street. At noon, she ate from a tin pail. Lead damage had left a faint tremor in her left hand, so she learned to brace her wrist against the bench. She never asked Clara for special treatment. Weeks passed before one of the women asked Agnes about Lydia. Agnes did not turn the dead into a saint. She remembered Lydia as impatient, untidy, brilliant with color, and terrible at keeping food from burning. She remembered that Lydia sang hymns out of tune during night firings. She remembered the little scar on Lydia's chin from a falling wearboard. Clara listened from the next table. These details were not a lost letter. They did not belong to Lydia alone. Still, they gave Clara something no formula could provide. A mother with habits, faults, and a living face. One afternoon, Agnes painted a small wren from memory. Its wings were folded. Nell painted another beside it, wings lowered for landing. Clara added a third, rising. The three birds became Riverbird's mark, but only when all three women worked on a piece together. No single one claimed it. The County Industrial Fair opened in October 1903, merely a year after the Riverview Exhibition. Riverbird Pottery occupied a modest booth at the edge of the women's pavilion. Harcourt filled the central hall with towers of white china and a new service called Imperial Rose. Ohio Dawn had quietly disappeared from the catalogue. Clara saw Edwin across the aisle on opening day. He no longer represented Harcourt. The Wheeling Notions firm had sent him to display buttons, combs, and sewing boxes. His table was small, his sign crooked, and his cuffs were neatly turned by his own uneven stitches. He greeted Clara without trying to take her arm. That restraint moved her more than the gold brooch had. Riverbird's display included Lydia's original test strips, Miriam's chemical notes, and the finished river blue ware. A printed card told visitors that the glaze grew from experiments begun by Lydia Rowan, Nathan Holloway, Agnes Vale, and Silas Bell, then completed by Miriam Sloane and Clara Rowan Vale. Every contributor was named. Silas complained that his name should be smaller because he only tended the fire. Clara refused. Fire was not only anything. Nell's repaired river drawing hung behind the booth. Beneath it stood a dinner set decorated with reeds and 3 wrens. The gold seams from her torn paper had become fine lines across the plates. They looked like paths of late sunlight on water. On the second day, a buyer from a women's college in Pennsylvania ordered 40 place settings. She wanted the makers' names left visible. Mrs. Holloway read the order twice. Bridget laughed. Ruth sat down and cried into her apron. The sale would not make them rich, but it would pay wages through winter and finance a second kiln. Clara carried the order to the rear of the pavilion where Agnes was unpacking cups. The older woman read it and pressed the paper to her chest. For a moment, Clara saw what Agnes might have been if fear had not governed her youth. A skilled decorator, proud of another woman's name, not threatened by it. They did not embrace. Their history was too complicated for an easy gesture. Clara set one hand briefly over Agnes's trembling fingers. It was enough. That evening, the fair committee awarded Riverbird a medal for design and safe glaze development. Mr. Harcourt protested that the category had been invented to reward scandal. The committee chairman answered that categories often changed when people finally noticed the work before them. The medal drew visitors. Among them came wives of factorymen, schoolgirls with sketchbooks, hotel buyers, and women who had spent years painting roses without seeing their names anywhere but a pay envelope. Some could not afford a cup. Clara let them hold one anyway. Late in the afternoon, a girl of about 12 turned a river blue bowl over and read Clara's full name aloud. The sound stopped her. Clara Rowan Vale. Not a joke, not a secret mark, not a husband's possession. A name spoken by a stranger because the work required it. Across the aisle, Edwin heard. He lowered his eyes. Clara understood then that his punishment was not the lost Harcourt position or the rented room. It was the knowledge that the woman he treated as an embarrassment had possessed a life large enough to continue without his permission. Whether he could build a worthy place within that life remained undecided. Winter came early. The college order kept Riverbird's kilns burning through December. Snow settled grey over East Liverpool, and the Ohio River moved between banks of ice. Clara hired 2 more decorators and reduced her boarding house to 3 tenants. For the first time since her marriage, she earned more from named craft than from feeding and cleaning for others. She did not abandon the boarding house work. Mr. Peake was old. The schoolmistress had nowhere affordable to go. Clara no longer regarded domestic labor as proof of failure, simply because Edwin once regarded it as invisible. The change was that she chose its boundaries. Edwin continued his Sunday visits. In January, he asked Clara to walk with him along the river. He did not request to return home. He said a year ago he would have believed losing his position was the worst thing a man could endure. It was not. The worst had been watching Nell measure every word before speaking to him, as if his affection might be withdrawn whenever her truth inconvenienced him. He had spent his life trying to escape his mother's shame, without understanding that he carried it into his own house. He had mistaken being served for being respected. He had mistaken Clara's patience for agreement. At the Riverview, when Harcourt looked at him, Edwin feared becoming the boy in a second-hand coat whose schooling came from mysterious money. So he pushed Clara beneath him to make himself appear higher. Clara listened. He did not say he had not meant it. He did not say she was partly to blame. He did not ask whether he had suffered enough. At the end of the walk, he gave her a small paper packet. Inside lay the gold rose brooch. He had paid the jeweller's bill and did not wish to keep it. Clara could sell it, give it to Nell, or throw it into the river. Clara closed the packet. She later sold the brooch and used the money to purchase protective aprons and a ventilation hood for Riverbird's glaze room. Gold that had been offered for silence became air women could breathe. Edwin laughed when Nell told him. It was the first time Clara heard him laugh at the loss of something that once represented status. Still, she did not invite him home. Love had not vanished. That was the inconvenient truth. It remained in small memories. Edwin warming her boots before an early shift when they were newly married, carrying Nell through 3 nights of croup, reading newspaper stories aloud when Clara's eyes were tired. A person could perform tenderness and cowardice with the same hands. Clara no longer believed love alone made a safe home. She told Edwin that if they were ever to live together again, he must learn to stand beside her when doing so cost him something, not only after the cost had already been paid. He accepted the answer. That spring he found a permanent sales position with a small glassworks in Wheeling. On his first journey east, he carried Riverbird samples in one corner of his case. He disclosed that his wife was a partner in the workshop. He sent back 3 orders and addressed each envelope to Mrs. Clara Rowan Vale. She noticed. She still did not hurry. In May 1904, Clara traveled to Pittsburgh with Nell and Agnes. St. Agnes Hospital had moved to a newer building, but an elderly sister found the old burial register. Lydia Rowan lay in Section F of Allegheny Cemetery, grave 214, beneath ground shared by patients whose families could not purchase stones. The 3 women climbed the hill under a mild rain. Agnes carried no black umbrella. Nell held the blue Wren. Clara carried a small stone marker paid for by the Riverbird workers, each woman contributing what she could. The inscription was simple. Lydia Rowan, mother and color maker, died 1881. Her work outlived the silence. They placed it at the head of the grave. Agnes stood apart. She said nothing until Clara asked whether Lydia truly believed blue held true, when the fire was kind. Agnes almost smiled. Lydia had said it whenever a test failed. It was her way of blaming neither clay nor fire too quickly. Kindness to Lydia did not mean softness. It meant giving every material what its nature required. Clara looked at the blue wren in Nell's palm. For years she had thought the grey wing was a failure. Miriam's analysis showed otherwise. Lydia deliberately glazed only one side, testing how the same clay behaved covered and bare. The bird had never been spoiled. It was evidence. It was also unfinished. Nell asked whether they should leave it on the grave. Clara considered the rain, the open ground, and the long journey the small bird had already made. Lydia had created it for the kiln, not the cemetery. They took it home. Back at Riverbird, Clara placed the wren on a shelf above the work tables. Beside it stood Nell's landing bird and Agnes's folded wing bird. No glass covered them. Dust settled. Hands lifted them. Visitors asked questions. Their value did not depend on remaining untouched. 2 years after the Riverview supper, Riverbird opened its second kiln. The workshop now employed 23 women and 4 men. Miriam established washing stations and changed the way dry materials were handled. Silas trained Ruth Kasky to read flame through the spy holes. Mrs. Holloway secured contracts with 2 colleges, a hospital, and a chain of dining rooms that wanted sturdy, named ware. Harcourt Pottery remained larger. It also began, quietly, to improve ventilation. Mr. Harcourt never credited Riverbird. Progress did not always arrive with apology. Sometimes it entered through a side door, because refusing it had become more expensive than pride. On the morning of the kiln opening, Clara arrived before dawn. Nell, now 17, had been accepted to the Cincinnati Art Academy with a partial scholarship. She would leave in September. The thought filled Clara with equal pride and fear. Mothers could spend years opening a door and still grieve when a daughter walked through it. Agnes stood near the cooling kiln with a shawl over her work dress. She had rented 2 rooms of her brick house and supported herself through decoration wages. The women no longer fell silent when she entered. They did not forget what she had done, either. She belonged among them in the difficult way a person belongs after truth, without innocence, but not without use. Edwin came from the early train. He carried his own case and wore a mended overcoat. He had been invited because Nell wanted him there. Clara gave him a cup of coffee. Their fingers touched. Nothing was settled by that touch, yet nothing was false in it. When the kiln had cooled enough, Ruth removed the first stopper. Warm air moved into the room. One by one, they drew the shelves. The new dinner service was called 3 Flights. Nell had designed it. Agnes painted the folded birds nearest the foot of each piece. Clara painted the rising birds near the rim. Nell's landing birds crossed the space between them. River blue deepened beneath the curves and thinned to gray at the edges. The first plate was sound. So was the second. Then a serving bowl emerged with a fine crack beneath one handle. Everyone grew quiet. Once, Clara would have hidden the bowl before a buyer saw it. Edwin would have called it necessary. Harcourt would have blamed a careless hand. Clara set the bowl on the rejection table in full view. She marked the flaw with chalk and asked Ruth to examine the firing position. Miriam checked the clay batch. Nell sketched a stronger handle. No one laughed. No one searched for a person to sacrifice. Work continued. By noon, the good pieces filled 3 long tables. Sun entered through the north windows and crossed the blue surfaces. When Silas tapped the rims, clear notes answered one after another. Not identical, but in agreement. Edwin stood beside Clara. He asked whether he might come to supper on Sunday. Not come home, not resume his place. Supper. Clara looked at Nell, who was pretending not to listen, and at Agnes, who had finally learned not to arrange her son's future for him. Clara said he might. It was not reconciliation. It was a door left unlocked. That evening, after the others departed, Clara remained alone in the workshop. The factory bells sounded across East Liverpool, releasing thousands of workers into the dusk. For most of her life, those bells had told her when to begin, when to stop, and what part of herself the town required. She lifted the old blue Wren from its shelf. The thumbprint beneath the wing fit her mother's hand, not hers. Clara had spent years believing it was her own because she had been taught to mistake inheritance for memory and another woman's erased work for company property. Now she could see the difference. On the shelf below stood a new Wren Clara had shaped that morning. Its wings were open. On the base she had written her full name before the clay dried. She placed the two birds side by side. Outside, the bells finished. Inside, the cooling pottery began to make its small evening sounds. A click from a shelf, a settling brick, the faint, clear ring of ware meeting the air. Clara listened without fear. The kiln had never needed a man to give it a voice. It had been speaking all along.